thanks very much for coming out. I imagine we're all kind of in the middle of CBAs with second years and giving back mocks with third years and everything else, and looking forward to the long weekend next week. So what I hope to do this evening hopefully will be helpful as we kind of look forward towards the end of the year, help you with planning, I suppose, for next year, and give you some ideas really about different ways to approach the topics on the course. And this just kind of comes from my own practice in my school over the last 3 years, the last 4 years really, teaching the new syllabus and trying to figure out what's the most time efficient and academically and educationally sound way of trying to cover the breadth of the material that's there, but in a way that can also engage students and get them to experience the subject in a little bit of depth. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Just before I do that, the shameless plug for the second edition of Artefact, which is out there now. So I know that our reps are going around with copies for schools, and we've completely redesigned it in terms of taking into account the lessons from the sample paper, feedback from teachers and students over the last number of years, and myself and Emer, who's my co-author, are incredibly proud of the work that we put in, and hope that it's as effective and as useful for people as the first edition was. We've kept all the features that people really liked in the first one and added stuff I think that will help people navigate through the course and engage students as much as possible this time around. So that's the last time I'm going to talk about that for the evening. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of go back and look at some of the learning outcomes, how to break them down, how to understand them. Secondly, I'm going to answer the question for you of how do I plan for the junior cycle. I'm going to take you through three different versions of our planning approach in my school, because we've changed with each new group of first years. We've tried something a little bit different with our plans because the course has changed so much. And so here's a number of options, I suppose. And then I'm going to show you how we've been able to integrate a number of learning outcomes into several topics. Right? So I'm going to start off with looking at Norman England, then at the struggle of Irish independence, then the Troubles, and then finally women in the 20th century in Ireland. And show you kind of the scope of where we might be able to go with kind of being more time efficient and more content smart, I suppose, there. And the last thing that obviously I'll take any questions that people have or thoughts or comments that people have. And not just really on this, but now given that we've all been through this now, and we're looking forward to kind of non-COVID teaching and going back to normal from September with no exceptions and so on, and no changes to the syllabus, hopefully. If people have thoughts about any part of the course, about any part of the course, please do, as Paul said, pop the question into the comments, and we will, and I'll endeavour to answer them as much as I can. Okay, and the key thing, I suppose, here is that there are lots of ways to complete the course. That's my kind of that's if you take away nothing else from this evening, that's my key kind of idea, my key message, that there is there's no one correct way, and I think the course is deliberately designed to be like that. It's designed to increase teacher autonomy. It's designed to allow students a wide variety of topics they can choose from in terms of fulfilling the learning outcomes. And that in some ways is a good thing, because it gives us that more freedom in our own classrooms, but also I think sometimes can be an overwhelming thing. And we're constantly asking ourselves, am I doing the right thing? Should I be doing something else? Those teachers in the school next door to me, they're not doing that. These books have a just slightly different approach. There are many different ways of doing it. And I suppose the kind of 3 or 4 ideas I'm going to give you this evening are just different ways that we've thought of approaching the learning outcomes and the specification. And I suppose that at our interdepartmental meetings in my school, we spent a little bit of time going through this, largely because I suppose of me having written the book. I've kind of pushed them for kind of feedback, my colleagues for feedback and stuff, and that's kind of generated some ideas and some thoughts, and those ideas are presented to you here this evening. Okay, so let's have a look then, just very briefly, at the learning outcomes, right? So there are three different types of learning outcomes. There are type A, which are very specific and very clear, right? And they're very clear about what the material that has to be covered and the time period that you have to cover, right? So they talk about, for example, in the Ireland section, they talk about the Troubles, they talk about Ireland between 1911 and 1923, they talk about the early Christian periods, they talk about the famine, they talk about women in Irish society in the 20th century, they talk about the 1960s, right? There is very specifically, it's very clear what the material is you're supposed to be covering when looking at those. Then there's an opportunity for choice, which are type B, which is very clear about the theme to be explored, but offers a range of choices about how the element can be covered in classes, right? So, for example, there's the one in Irish history about the plantations and a pattern of settlement. There's a number of different ways to kind of approach that. Obviously, you have to do the plantations, but there's obviously a number of different plantations you could do and a number of different patterns of settlement you could do. So you could do ancient Ireland and the first settlers in Ireland. You could approach it through doing the expansion of medieval Dublin. You could look at the growth of towns after the plantations. There's a range of different options there. Similarly, there's more than two leaders in the parliamentary tradition, so there's a range of choices there. There's a range of pre-20th century Irish rebellions. It's not just 1798 that you need to look at. And there's a choice between you looking at the impact of World War I or World War II on people, right? So there's a range of kind of opportunities there for you to make choices for your students. And then there's type C, which in some ways can be like the most frustrating of them all, which are the ones that cut across different topics that are thematic, right? And that you have to kind of tick along with as you're going through other ones, right? And that's where students kind of make the connection. And a lot of that, so for example, are done through the CBAs in 2.11 there, or in 2.13, they're done through covering multiple times where Irish history has been linked in with. So those are the three different types in Irish history. Similarly, in European and the wider world history, there are specific and clear ones. The Spanish and Portuguese conquests, the medieval life and death in medieval times, the Cold War, and so on. There's ones that give you opportunity for choice. So there's an ancient or medieval civilization students have to study. There's one revolution in the pre-20th century world. Most people will either do America or France for that one, World War I or World War II, life in a fascist country or a communist country. Well, there's more than one of both of those, so there's some choice involved there, and so on, right? So there's a range of choices that there's choices to be made for students there. And then, of course, there's the thematic ones here, right? And these are the ones that kind of run through all of the various different or several different aspects of history, and students kind of do them as they look at other things, right? So the two here are the one about technological developments and how technological change has contributed to historical change, and the second one where you're supposed to illustrate a pattern of change across a number of areas, such as crime and punishment, food and drink, and so on. And where could that fit in? So the one that I do with my students is health and medicine, and how, because it's quite easy to see the very significant and big changes that have taken place there. So those are the kind of three different types of learning outcomes. And our goal when we kind of sat down to do our planning this year has been to look at our type A learning outcomes, the specific and clear ones, and then marry those as much as possible with topics in types B and C, in order to allow us to pair them up essentially and duplicate the task, right? Or to avoid duplicating the task. So you'll see what I mean by this in a second, but we would have started out doing essentially a different topic for each of the learning outcomes. And now we've gone back and said, no, we can do this one topic. For example, Norman England or England in the Middle Ages covers more than one learning outcome. And that allows us then to spend more time on it, and less time we have to spend kind of doing additional topics with students. And the idea here is to give yourself a little bit more space and a little bit more flexibility within the classroom to perhaps focus on things that you're interested in or that your students are interested in, and to remove that pressure, which I think is really there with the new course, to constantly be moving on, to constantly be introducing something new. There's very little time sometimes to stop and think with the new course. And that's what these ideas are designed to kind of put forward. Okay, so this is what's up here now is our original plan for the 3 years of the junior cycle for the first group of first years we had. So these would be students who are now in transition year or fifth year, and if they skip transition year. These are the ones who were in second year during the these are the ones who were in third year during the first lockdown when COVID hit. The ones in second year during the first lockdown when COVID first hit. And second year then with the Reformation.
Greg, you just froze for a second there, so we're just going to rewind back about 10 seconds. Just stepping in for.
Sorry about that.
No, you're right.
I think that the problem there was that my phone, which I was hotspotting, has switched itself off. So that's what happened there. Apologies for that, folks. Can you hear me now? Paul, is that all right?
Absolutely no problem. Go for it.
Sorry about that. So I was saying that in the second year, then when those kids moved into second year, we started with the Reformation, then the plantations, then the American Revolution, and so on and so forth, and kind of pegging through, particularly the struggle for independence at a really fast pace. And we weren't really happy with that at all, to get onto Ireland in World War II, and then starting back then in third year with Ireland in the 60s, the Troubles, women in 20th century Ireland, and so on and so forth, right? So we were hurtling through it at quite a pace. Then, of course, COVID hit, and we went into lockdown then. And they were, when we went to the second lockdown, so these are the kids who would have been in third year of the second lockdown. Had that not happened, and had we not had the changes with the junior cert that year, I think that we would struggle to finish. But because we could design our own junior cycle exam, we stopped at the end of the Cold War and just kind of left it at that. And that we thought that was good for us. But ultimately, our experience, having done the first year of that, was not a positive one. So we sat down and we looked at where possibly we could move things around, we could cut back on some of the material and combine learning outcomes into single topics. So that brought us on to version 2, which is the second version of this. And what we took out of first year were 2 things. We took out ancient Rome. We decided we would make the Middle Ages, we'd expand the Middle Ages to look at a medieval civilization. And from there, and then we looked at, we also kind of minimized quite an awful lot what we did about Ireland in the Middle Ages, and moved our pattern of settlement study more into the plantations later on. So that allowed us to free up time at the end of the year. So we added the Reformation from second year, so that went into the end of first year. Then when we got into second year, we had a separate section on Charles Stewart Parnell, which we covered as one of our parliamentary leaders. We decided to take that out of second year, and with the Reformation gone, Parnell gone, we then were able to add a number of topics, shorter topics from third year, particularly Ireland in the 60s, and the experience of women in the 20th century in Ireland at the end of second year, leaving us then starting with the Troubles in third year, and then moving on to the international history sections throughout third year. That was we found that quite positive. That kind of freed up a little bit of time for us quite a lot. But there was a concern, I think, particularly with the fact that we knew coming into with this year's first years that because they'll have 2 CBAs to do, that we wanted a little bit more flexibility. So we went for a slightly more radical version this year. And we are kind of, we're trialing this version, so this is version 3. We're trialing this version, and we're doing this with 2 of our 4 classes, and we're doing version 2 with the other 2 of the classes. So at the end of the year, we'll be able to compare our experiences with, right? So what we did here, again, we cut ancient Rome and Ireland in the Middle Ages. That hadn't changed. In the second year course, we took out Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell and the GEA, and I'll show you what we replaced those with in a second. And then third year was left largely the same, starting with the Troubles and moving on to the legacy of World War I and so on from that. And what we did in order to be able to do that, the changes we made in particular were firstly in the Middle Ages, so we expanded that to cover the ancient civilization. We expanded, we did a little bit more on Irish independence to cover one of our parliamentary leaders. We expanded women in the experience of women in the 20th century to cover the women's rights movement in Ireland, to cater for our social or sporting or cultural movements, the social movement, learning outcome 2.10. And then in third year, we expanded the Troubles a little bit, or our plan is, because this will be next year's class. In third year, we'll expand the Troubles a little bit to incorporate our second leader of the parliamentary tradition in Irish history. And the goal being that, that gives us, we have, for those two classes, they will study less topics. They will do some of those in much more depth. But we're fairly confident, we think, or certainly we hope, that this will allow them to then answer the same sections on paper without any problems, and allow them to kind of have the experience of studying some of these in a little bit more depth. Now, if we find that isn't working terribly successfully for us, we have the option then to reverse back, of course. Because certainly the thing that I found, and I'm sure many of you have found as well, that the course is very flexible, probably a little bit too flexible, unlike the old course, which is very cut and dry, what you did in first, second, and third year. Each year group is a little bit different. Each class is a little bit different. Some will work with you really well, some won't. For some, it's a struggle. If you've got a lot of weak students, then doing less, but doing a little bit more depth is probably better for them. There's less confusion. So that's kind of our approach. And that's certainly we've taken with some classes this year, right? And then, so what we've done here, right, in terms of our benefits we identified of version number 3 was, one, there's less material for students to cover, right? And that's being the first thing, in some ways the most important thing. There's less pressure on teachers to constantly be moving on. You can take a class to breathe. If you want to spend an extra class doing, I'm not sure they really followed that. So let's do a source question here. Let's get them to maybe do some research on their own and present to the class. There's more room for that kind of range of activities, we think, in this in this kind of option, right? It allows time for you to the use of more sources in class. We certainly have found that with the first years and the second year class that we're doing this version with. I have that kind of extra class or two quite often to kind of, okay, let's pick a source question here. And given that the exam features so many source questions now, and they're all based off sources, giving students the opportunity to use more of those in class as part of their learning is really important for us. A little bit more time with CBAs, particularly the class who are doing version number 3 have had more in-time class time to be able to devote to their CBAs. And we think there'll be more time for revision at the end of third year. That's the kind of hope, that's the goal. And we might find that at the end of second year this year, you have a little bit more extra time. And if that's the case, we might kind of pull in maybe one of the short topics like the legacy of World War I into the end of second year, so they have that covered and are good to go with communist Russia at the start of third year. We're comfortable enough to be able to kind of make those decisions, as we go. There are drawbacks, and it would be wrong to suggest that there aren't. There is a potential that students will come across material on the junior cycle exam that they haven't done in class, and they may, so they might see a document say about the Gaelic League, but we never did the Gaelic League. So I don't know anything about that. That's obviously a potential problem for any for any kind of question at the moment, because one, we don't have enough knowledge about how the exam is going to be asked. And secondly, there are so many options that can be drawn on for some of the more flexible learning outcomes that any source could be asked. So you could have done the GAA And the question about a social movement is the Gaelic League, or it's the 1913 lockout, or it's something else entirely. So they do need to be prepared to apply their learning to the tasks that are asked, right? So there will, I think in this scenario, you'd have to spend a little bit of time talking to them about kind of like what learning outcomes mean, how they apply their knowledge to the particular learning outcome, and how what they're studying fits into the learning outcome that they're looking at. That's a skill that they'll have to develop, and kind of making them more familiar with learning outcome based questions would be important there as well, I think, as part of that. Okay, so that's just some of the potential drawbacks, because it would be wrong to suggest that we're not, when we were doing this, we couldn't think of any, because we could, and it's important that I think we factor that into any decisions we make about our planning. Okay, so let me just show you how we do this then, right? So the first example, and this was the first big change we made, and we've developed this a little bit over the years, and it's now the example that's now how we've approached teaching the Middle Ages in the second edition of Artefact, is that we now talk about Norman England as being our medieval civilization, right? So in here, we're covering 3 different learning outcomes, 2 fully and then 2 partially. So the first one that we're covering fully is to investigate the lives of people in one ancient or medieval civilization of their choosing, explaining how the actions and or achievements of that civilization contributed to the history of Europe and or the wider world, right? So that's very much just looking at life in Norman England, and kind of how the Normans, their achievements, how they contributed to life in England and to the rest of Europe, right? And that very naturally fits on to the second of the learning outcomes about the Middle Ages, which is exploring life and death in the Middle Ages. Because all those things that we would naturally do in teaching the Middle Ages, teach them about the manor, life in the castle, life in the monastery, life in the town, those are all parts of life in Normandy. And many of those aspects of life were introduced more fully into England after the Norman invasion in 1066 than they were before, particularly the feudal system. Was introduced more fully by the Normans than it had been under the Anglo-Saxons. So those 2 things naturally fit very easily together, and that's how we were able to make those 2 work. Secondly, then, or thirdly, there's an aspect of technological development that could be covered here in terms of looking at farming in the Middle Ages and changes in weapons and warfare in the Middle Ages as technological developments that would link in there. And lastly, the passion of change, looking at health and medicine, and particularly focusing on medieval medicine and the Black Death as one aspect of the passion of change in health and medicine. So those are kind of the 4 things we've done. And then just on the next slide, I just kind of provided some of the ideas about where we drew our information from, and some kind of online resources, stuff that you can use if you want to do this with your students, right? So as I said, the basic approach is the same, because you're looking at people's lives in manors, castles and towns, monasteries, and so on. Okay. There's a small amount of additional material needed specifically about the Normans as a medieval civilization to fulfill 3.1. But that I found that's 2 or 3 classes. 2 at the start, maybe 1 at the end, 2 at the end to look at the achievements of the Normans, right? And then there's just a number of kind of websites there that have good resources. So things like the BBC one there is particularly good. There's lots of really good timelines and activities there for students. The TED-Ed on Normans and their impact on Europe is brilliant for looking at the achievements of the Normans, that part of the learning outcome, and looking at the invasion and their weaponry and their primary sources. That animated video of the Bayeux Tapestry there is also excellent for the same reason, that it really does engage students in that way. And then in terms of technological innovation, you have kind of Norman weapons. So there's a close look at the Battle of Hastings, which would fit very nicely in with the animated version of the Bayeux Tapestry. And then taking in some aspects of Irish history and the impact that we want to bring the Normans into Norman Ireland into the conversation, then that article is all about how the Normans conquered Ireland because of the the weapons superiority they had over the Irish. And again, that would highlight the importance of military technological innovation to change in history. So Ireland essentially, or Leinster certainly, is conquered by the Normans, and a whole new phase in Irish history begins as a result. Then you've got health and medicine, and that's all about obviously the Black Death and medieval medicine, right? And those two videos there are really, really good. The first one on history in a nutshell from the English Heritage Foundation is excellent for the way it kind of illustrates different aspects of medieval medicine in kind of an animated format. The second one about medieval surgery, it's a little bit gory, so it might work with some classes, might not work with others, but it's all about the surgical procedure of taking an arrowhead out of a wounded soldier. It's very good. Like it does work quite well, but some of the more squeamish kids find it a little bit hard going. So again, something to think about your own students if you were to use that. So that's one way. So that allowed us then to save about 3 weeks worth of time when we weren't covering ancient Rome, to spend then at the end of the year to cover the Reformation. So that's how that changed our year plan for first years. Okay. Then the second one then is one thing so that's the first thing we did. The second one then was we looked for ways of integrating some of the notion of the parliamentary tradition into other topics in Irish history. And the first one we identified was the struggle for Irish independence between 1911 and 1923. So again, here, the primary focus is still on Learning Outcome 2.4, which is to examine the rise and impact of nationalism and unionism in Ireland, including the key events between 1911 and 1923. And that's everything from the Home Rule crisis through Ireland and World War I, the Rising, First Dáil, the War of Independence, the Civil War, partition, all of that. That is that big, huge topic that I always find really engaging with students, and that you want to have that little bit of space, I think, in time, particularly with all the new resources and all the new information that's available now, because of the decade of commemorations, to allow students to explore fully. We added to that an element of Learning Outcome 2.2, and that was to investigate the role and significance of two leaders involved in the parliamentary tradition in Irish politics, right? And we chose to focus here on John Redmond, the last bar one leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, who had come so close to achieving Home Rule for Ireland in 1914 before World War I got in the way. And our decision there was based on a number of things, right? One, we kind of talked a lot about what we understood to be the parliamentary tradition in Irish politics and where it impacted on Irish history. So, O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell is an obvious figure there. Parnell is an obvious figure. Redmond is also one that sometimes gets swept up and ignored because of the more dominating figures of Carson or of Padraig Pearse, and ultimately because he fails and passes away quite tragically in 1918. And so so we decided we would spend a little bit of time, only 2 classes, on looking at John Redmond's life and going through it to give the students that sense of the contrast of it, like that there was another alternative there for Ireland in this period, that the violent revolution, the War of Independence weren't the only course that Ireland could have taken. And we thought that was an important contrast to draw forth. In terms of why we decided to focus there and not look at the two in the 19th century, was quite simple. Wasn't simple, but our thinking behind this was that in order to teach both O'Connell and Parnell, you have to introduce students to a whole range of kind of background information that is quite. You have to go into some depth. For O'Connell, there's the whole question of Catholic emancipation, of the Act of Union, of Ireland under the Union, the repeal movement, all that sort of stuff, which, while perhaps is linked a little bit into the famine, doesn't naturally link into anything else. So that sometimes we find that they struggle with that. And the same problem is there with Parnell, but only more so in that the land war is quite a complicated topic. The relationship between Parnell and the IRB, the new departure, that's quite complicated. The Parnell split is quite complicated. So there's a lot of kind of additional stuff that students need to cover if they were to cover one of those. So this for us was a way of kind of stepping around those problems, looking at a topic that we already had to cover, which is the struggle for independence, and expanding on an aspect of that, which sometimes gets a little bit ignored in the violent struggle for independence aspect. Though it's important to note that you do save a little bit of time doing it this way. So if you wanted to, you could do O'Connell as well, Parnell as well as Redmond, and that would fulfill your requirements under Learning Outcome 2.2. Then in terms of kind of just the resource and stuff, in Artefact edition 2, we have a full key personality on Redmond there to aid the teaching of this. There's a number of pieces there, a number of links there to one of them on the 100th anniversary of his death from RTE, which again tries to put him in the context of that wider struggle within nationalism and which way the Irish nationalist movement would go. There's a film version of his, or a reenactment of his Wooden Bridge speech just after World War II begins. Some really kind of interesting footage of the commemorations of Redmond from British Pathé in the 1920s. That happens every year on the anniversary of his death in Wexford. And then the National Library online exhibition on Redmond about his, there's posters and letters and documents there about him. And given that students have to also look at a historical repository, and that you might not have got the chance to bring them to a museum because of COVID or anything there, then you could use that as a way to access, to fill that learning outcome in Strand as well. So there's that opportunity there. So that's our first, and that's what we're doing at the moment with our second years. Next year, when those lads move into third year, we will, when we do the troubles, we're going to finish looking at Learning Outcome 2.2 here. And this is where we're going to focus on our other leader in the parliamentary tradition, and that person being John Hume, right? So again, the standard approach to teaching the troubles, it would be the same, looking at the origins of the troubles, the civil rights movement, Battle of the Bogside, Bloody Sunday, the Sunnydale Agreement, the hunger strikes, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the peace process, and so on, right? And all the various different aspects of those key events that you would look at with students. But in addition to that, we will find time within that to focus on the role of and the achievements of John Hume. Again, we kind of agree that he very much is in keeping with the same kind of tradition of Irish parliamentarianism, that kind of looking for peaceful solutions to the Irish national question, which is what the Irish parliamentary tradition means. It's not anyone who happens to be a parliamentarian in Ireland. It's someone who represents that kind of peaceful tradition within Irish nationalism, as opposed to the physical force tradition within Irish nationalism. So there's two ways to do this. There's the short way, which is to follow the same way as we do for Redmond, which is just to take two classes, probably at the end of looking at the troubles, and just look at his life in depth with students and his role in Northern Irish history. That's fine. That was certainly one approach. The other approach is, and this is the one that I'm planning to do, or hoping to do with my third years next year, is to look at Hume as an aspect, or his life as an aspect of each step of the history of the Troubles. Because of when John Hume was born in the late 30s, and when he came to his political maturity just as the Troubles are beginning in the late 60s, and is a key player all the way through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and into the early 2000s. And therefore, his life reflects, in many ways, that nationalist experience of what was going on in Northern Ireland as part of the Troubles. So what we've done here is to, my plan is to have students keep a log as they go of his involvement at each section, and then to write up a report on him at the end, to kind of look at him as a leader of the parliamentary tradition. So here are some resources that I think are really useful for looking at his life. The obituary of him that was published 2 years ago on his death, The Guardian, is an excellent piece of writing about him that kind of looks at him from a non-Irish perspective and puts him into an international context, and very well written there. RTE did when they were doing Ireland's greatest ever Irish person about 10 years ago. Miriam O'Callaghan did a documentary piece on him. It's available in several parts on YouTube and totally on YouTube. It's really, really good because, again, there's interviews, both some of his interviews from earlier on in his life, interviews with people who know him. There's a lot of primary sources of video footage and stuff done in it, and it's easily segmented. So you could easily do, well, let's have a look at the piece on his early life. Let's have a look at the piece on his time during Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and so on. And then the Irish Times have a series of articles on his death that look at every conceivable aspect of his life that you could easily draw from to create kind of meaningful learning outcomes and learning experiences for students in class. And then if you want to do a step-by-step approach, here's how I plan to kind of integrate Hume's story into the Northern Ireland story, right? So if you're looking at the background of the Troubles, to sectarianism, to discrimination against Catholics and so on, John Hume wrote a series of articles for the Irish Times in the 60s about life in Derry for Catholics, where he talks about that kind of everyday discrimination, the problems with housing, the problems with the police, the problems with schooling, the problems with the lack of jobs. It's all there in his own words. So you tell that story through Hume's words. If you want to look at the civil rights movement, he was involved in filming a 20-minute piece for the BBC called John Hume's Derry in 1969. It's on YouTube, and it's also very good. And again, that visual element, seeing the discrimination writ large, is very effective, I find. Then you've got, if you want to look at Bloody Sunday, you have his interview 5 years after Bloody Sunday, where he describes his experience of the day itself. If you want to look at some of the darkest days of the Troubles, there's one extract from Ireland's greatest documentary, which covers that kind of the Shankill bombing and the murder of Catholics at Grey Steel, and this terrible trauma and the impact that had on him. And then if you want to look at the end of his career after the Good Friday Agreement, in the teacher's resource book for Artefact, there's an extract from that speech, and there's a whole learning task built around that. So that's kind of those 5 kind of key moments in the story of Northern Ireland, which are all kind of told essentially through his eyes. That also helps, I think, build student empathy and understanding of recent historical events by looking at a single person, which I hope will be effective in that way. So that's kind of 2 of those, or 3 of those examples of where we've integrated. And the third one, or the fourth one, is looking at the experience of women in 20th century Ireland, right? So again, there's the specific learning outcome here, which is 2.9, which says explain how the experience of the experience of women in Irish society changed during the 20th century, right? So in this one, you have women in the early 20th century. You look at the fight for the vote, women in the independence movement, the women's experience during the conservative independent Irish state, changes in women's work and education in the 60s, the movement for equality from the 70s onwards, and so on, right? So that's the broad number of topics you're probably covering. And then I think you can pair that with learning outcome 2.10, which is examine how one sporting, cultural, or social movement impacted on Irish life. And in a lot of people I know, and some of my colleagues certainly will do the Gaelic League, or the GAA, or the IRFU, or the trade union movement for this one. And that's absolutely fine. That definitely will cover that. And we provide a lot of those new options in the second edition of Artefact. But what I'm trialing with this class is using the Irish women's movement and the movement for equality to fulfill that as the social movement within that learning outcome. And the focus here would be how Irish feminist movements in the 20th century, right? And in particular, the suffrage campaign before World War I, and the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. Now, I teach in a boys' school, and I don't underestimate the fact that they're going to find some of this quite difficult, but I think that's actually quite important, right? That they are challenged with a side of history that, one, they have almost certainly never spent an awful lot of time thinking about themselves, and secondly, is really important that they appreciate and they understand. So I'm interested and curious to see how this one will work in that environment. So as I say, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 classes looking at the suffrage movement. There's three resources here, but one I want to talk about in particular. So there's an article about the Irish suffragettes in History of Ireland. Goes into an awful lot of depth. Probably wouldn't give students the whole article, but there's bits you could definitely pull out. There's lots of good stories in that. The Oireachtas Vote All 100 website is excellent. It's absolutely brilliant. When I was putting this together last night, I'd forgotten quite how good it was. I spent about 20 minutes just kind of clicking on all the various different links. There's articles, there's printable posters, like there's like the image of that one there, the road to the vote. There's video clips, interviews with women in lots of different aspects of Irish life. It's a brilliant resource for teachers, and you can tell that it was clearly developed by a teacher for use by teachers in classrooms, because it really is an excellent piece of work. And then at the bottom there's a number of short videos from Century Ireland, the Decade of Commemorations project about the women's suffrage movement, looking at various different aspects, interviews with historians, and particular events and so on. They're all quite short. They're all about 5 or 6 minutes long each. And I'm looking forward to seeing how my students kind of respond to this particular aspect, because it's not an aspect of their history they're going to have thought about an awful lot beforehand. So that's one movement, and then the other movement that I'm kind of going to do, because I think it pairs nicely because of the similarity in tactics and goals, is the Irish women's liberation movement from the early 70s, right? And looking at how a group of women from across Irish life come together in 1971 to find the liberation movement, and how they begin to push for what at the time was seen as massively radical change, but today seems even relatively moderate or even conservative in terms of the things that they were advocating for at the time. So, for example, there's an article on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the movement from the Irish Times. There's a great archive of video clips on the RTE Archives website called Milestones for Irish Women. There's clips on, throughout, so across the last kind of 30 or 40 years of RTE reporting about different aspects of change for women, and that's even if you're not focusing on this, there's brilliant stuff in there about kind of changes to home life and work practices and everything else. Then there's that famous article about 10 things that an Irish woman could not do in 1970. Now, a word of warning with this one, some of those are they're a little bit obscure legal stuff, which I don't think the average kind of 14 or 15-year-old would necessarily understand. But there are some great examples in there about about not being able to buy a pint in a pub and not being able to divorce their husband. That kind of stuff is really impactful, I find, for students. And then there's that clip there, which is linked to the bottom, about the contraception train to Belfast, from the BBC, and the BBC report marking the 50th anniversary of that. And that, I think, again, will, I think, illustrate quite well for students the kind of approach that campaigners adopted in Ireland for some of these causes. And I'm looking forward to kind of expanding that. So I would imagine I'll spend about 2 classes, maybe 2-3 classes, if it's going particularly well on this. So that will cover that, but I'll have saved that time from earlier on in the year so I can spend it here. It's within the context of stuff that they're learning anyway about the changing experience of women in the 20th century. So it's not new stuff and additional stuff they have to learn. It fits within the context of things that they've already learned. And I think in particular for weaker students who have, who will struggle with the amount of material they're expected to know from the junior cert year, I think this approach hopefully will be beneficial for them. So that's that. Hopefully that all kind of made sense on some kind of level. Before I answer questions, and please do keep on sending them in. The one thing I would say is this is just one version of how to approach the junior cycle. We're not 100% sold on it for us. That's why we're doing it with half our students and not doing it with the other half, to see how it works for us. There might be elements of this that you might the Northern England thing might work for you, but for your students actually doing the trade union movement or the GAA as a social movement, you want to hold on to that. Or the depending on the part of the country you're from, if there's a strong Parnell or O'Connell connection down where you're from, that might be more appropriate there, or whatever. Like, there's a range of options here. These are just a number of options that I'm hopeful will work for me as a teacher and for my students. And so the option is there, essentially. So, questions?
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Greg. That was awesome. So first question, Connor asks, do you find there's a concern that in relation to like the final exam, dropping one part, not dropping another? This year in the mock, there was a question in World War I and not in World War II. The concern being that in the final exam, will it not allow for these two options? So
I'm not familiar with the mock that you're referring to, because we don't do third year mocks for this exact reason, because we have so much material to cover because of COVID this year. What I would say is that if a mock question specifically required students to write only about World War I, so for example, if the phraseology of the question was write about a battle in World War I that you have studied, that question would not be in keeping either with the sample paper as delivered by the SEC, or with the sample questions delivered by the NCCA, and therefore I don't think that would be a legit question for someone to set, for the SEC to set, because it would definitely not be in keeping with the learning outcome, nor would it be in keeping with the samples that the official bodies have released. I think it's always important to remember that that mock papers are done by teachers or by people who the mock companies hire to write them for them. They have no more knowledge than you or I do about the kind of questions that could be asked. And so, but certainly looking at the sample papers and stuff, a specific question about World War I would, now you can have a source about World War I and a general question after it asking about World War I or World War II, that would be fine. But if there's a detailed question about an aspect of World War I you had to have studied, say, write about a battle or what have you, that I don't think would be permissible based on what the SEC have said themselves on their own sample paper. That's certainly my hope. And that's my reading of what the SEC and the NCCA have done, because deliberately they've moved away from specified content in a lot of areas to allow for greater flexibility, so which would fly in the face of that.
Yeah. So second question from Katie. I think this is related to Plan 2, or the Plan 2, the kind of second version you had. Do you kind of see any issues getting through the amount of content you have stacked in second year?
So we would have spent, because we took the Reformation and Parnell out the first time, we were under quite a bit of pressure when we went through that year. So that's why when we sat down to it again, we took out O'Connell as well, and that gave us that little bit of flexibility around that. So that's where that kind of learning came from for us. I don't know if we all finished. I think of the three of us who had second years that year, I'm not sure that we all finished what we had planned to do by the end of second year. I think that was lockdown 1 second year. Sure. So we may have finished it because it was all online, and the kids were just being given homework in a lot of cases just to read stuff and do it. How much they actually did, of course, during that process, it is difficult to know. Yeah,
for sure. So kind of like just a follow on to that question we have about that content. Are you guys kind of as a team, as in a teaching team, are you guys planning together that you're going to cover things at a very similar time, or are you fairly free to just run on yourself and see where other people land?
We would have kind of commonly agreed that by Christmas we will all have done X, Y, and Z, and so that all the students in the year will sit a common Christmas exam. Now that won't be possible for the current second years, so there'll be 2 classes will do one and 2 classes will do a different paper, because they're not the depending on which version of our plan we're going with. We would envisage ultimately having a single plan, whichever one we think works best for us. But we would keep in relatively close contact. We'd have a department WhatsApp group. We'd check in. We would have kind of, we wouldn't all use the same one. We'd often have kind of common at the end of each topic. We're doing an in-class test. We'll have, here's a good sample question that I used for my medieval England test. So if anyone wants to use that or whatever, we would do it that way. And we would be relatively all on the same page. Roughly speaking, finishing each topic around the same time.
Yeah, makes an awful lot of sense. So there was just a quick question from Pork. I'll take this one. So Pork asks, will the notes be available to participants after the presentation? Yes, Pork, absolutely. We can happily share them with you. If you just drop us a mail to events@educate.ie, we can send on the presentation to you forthwith. No problem at all on that one. So anything else, folks? Long question from Sham here. Thank you, Sham. Absolutely brilliant. Cleared the windscreen. I like that term or phrase. O'Connell and Parnell is a tough going in second year. Debated long and hard about ancient Rome, and it looks like we will go down the route Gregg has gone. We still like to do ancient Ireland as much as we feel it should be done, plus also lead in early Christian Ireland. That makes a lot of sense. I think other people have come to similar conclusions as your team in CBC, Gregg, that that some things need to be trimmed. The fat needs to be a little bit trimmed off the edges. So O'Connell, Parnell, tough going. The parliamentary tradition is the question he wants to work around to asking. I'll give you a chance to type on that, Sham, and then I'll come back to you. Take your time with that. Any other shorter questions we can get to? So the parliamentary tradition, they don't have to be connected as in the same time period.
No. So I think my understanding of parliamentary tradition is what I was taught in college by the great Michael Laffan himself, was that when the parliamentary tradition and the physical force tradition are the two sides of the Irish nationalist history coin, right? So, they both want to achieve greater freedom for Ireland, with the goal of Irish independence as being the ultimate, end goal for both sides. Where they differ is on tactics. So the parliamentary tradition leaders like O'Connell, Parnell mostly, Redmond certainly, Hume definitely, all reject the use of violence to achieve Irish independence or to resolve the Irish national question. On the physical force side of things, so people like Wolfe Tone, Padraig Pearse, Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins during the War of Independence certainly, are all will all be physical force members of that tradition within Irish politics, and therefore would be prepared to use violence to achieve Irish independence. The other difference is, I suppose, between the two sides is where they're willing to stop, what they're willing to where the line of compromise is. Again, the parliamentary tradition are probably willing to settle for less full independence. The physical force tradition traditionally has not been. It would not be correct to take kind of like people who happen to have been in an Irish parliament or represented an Irish constituency in Westminster as being part of the parliamentary tradition. That wouldn't be correct. So unionists, for example, don't fit into the parliamentary tradition because their parliamentary tradition talks about nationalism. Is a nationalist concept. It's not a general Irish history concept. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And to answer the question, they don't have to be linked. It's just the theme is what links them rather than the events.
For sure. So basically the question here that like Sham has put is like, do you have to, when you're teaching parliamentary tradition, do you want to link Redmond and Carson with Carson? No, not necessarily important, because parliamentary tradition being intrinsically into nationalism. Okay, that's fun. Yeah. Also, I like that you brought up Michael Laffan, who would be judging us both for not saying Parnell.
He would. That is absolutely true. That is absolutely
true. Awesome. Isolt, thanks for that. Sham, all good. Happy to help. Michelle, I will organize that to be sent to you. She's just looking for a copy of the presentation. Yeah, no problem. I'll sort that out. Any other questions, folks? If not, we can let everyone get on with their evenings. Okay. I think, Gregg, you've covered it all in detail. Really, really appreciate it, my man. Brilliant. Yeah, you're very welcome, everyone. Thank you very, very much.
And thanks for coming along, folks. And I might tweet out a link to the presentation. I might help everyone rather than you emailing it to everyone. If that helps.
That works. Power of social media works for me, Greg. That'd be great. Also, we can tweet out a link on the Educate account as well.
I'll tweet that out today at some stage this evening or first thing in the morning.
Awesome. Brilliant. Guys, thank you very, very much for joining. And you'll be hearing from us on future webinars going forward. So thanks very much all. I'll leave it there. God bless.
Thanks, folks.